It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS, AM 1160 and 101.1 FM. And we're on the line today with Mark Obmascik. The book is called The Storm on Our Shores, One Island, Two Soldiers, and the Forgotten Battle of World War II. And what a battle it was. And what a story you tell us, Mark. It's amazing, these two particular people that you've picked out on which to center your book. One, a doctor in the Japanese Army who got his education here in America and could as well been on the American side during World War II. And the other is a gentleman from, well, he's from this area in Indiana County. In fact, one of the towns that you mentioned for Laird is Clarksburg. The story is the amazing story of the forgotten battle of World War II on a little place called Attu. Tell us where that is.
Well, Attu is the westernmost island of the Aleutian chain of Alaska. It's so far out there that they actually curved the international date line around it to keep North America on the same calendar page. It's farther west than Fiji, and actually it's about the same. It's about as far west as New Zealand. So it is way out there, but it is part of North America. And what I found out was that this is the only U.S. soil lost since the War of 1812. And there was a casualty rate in the Battle of Attu that was exceeded in the Pacific War only at Iwo Jima. I mean, it was the only ground battle that was fought on North American soil during World War II. And these were all things I didn't know. You know, I had the traditional view of the Pacific War growing up, you know, the classic, Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, Midway, and so forth. And so I was fascinated. I didn't know that the Japanese had taken part of Alaska during World War II, and so I launched my research.
Paul Nobuo Tatsuguchi, I'm going to get his name wrong, I know, throughout the course of the interview, and Dick Laird are the people that we meet, the two principals that we meet in this story. And the fact of the actual battle of Attu is one thing, but then you put the actual personalities of the story in here, and you start the book in such a heartbreaking way as Dick Laird goes to visit Paul's wife and daughter many, many years after the war. And he does so because he's so guilt-ridden over his role in Paul's death. And that aspect of the book as a whole was what really grabbed me. And he has no idea how to approach it, but he knew that he had to be there.
Laura Davis is an intensive care nurse who is living in Los Angeles. Her elderly mother has just moved in with her, and one day she gets a knock on the door from an elderly man she does not recognize. He is clearly nervous, kind of fidgeting around, and just starts kind of rambling. Talks about how he's retired to Tucson and loves to grow rare orchids. And Laura Davis is listening to this, and she's very polite, but finally says, I've got 5-year-old twins who are pounding each other here. Nice to meet you, but it's time to go. Mm-hmm. So she walks him out to his car, and before he gets in his car, he kind of turns over his shoulder and says to her, "Oh, by the way, I'm the one who killed your father." And he drives off. Now, Laura is devastated. She has never met her father. She knows that he was killed in war, but, time has moved on, and her father exists mainly as photographs on the wall. And so she's distraught, and she spends the next years of her life trying to find out not only how her father lived, but also how he died. And as for Laird, Laird had 3 weeks of battle in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and at this point he's a pretty old guy, but he's still haunted, 4 decades later, by what he had done. He won one of the nation's greatest military honors for his service on Attu. He won the Silver Star, and yet he just can't shake the feeling that although he did what his superiors told him to do, his heart is still torn. And it was so moving to me that these two people, ultimately the politicians declare war and the generals do the strategy of war, but ultimately war is something that's fought by people. And the peace is figured by people and their families. And some are able to do that, successful to do that, and others the pain is too great. But here are two families who there's no other reason in the world why they would ever be connected, and yet here they were on a battlefield in one of the most difficult places on earth. And they figured out a way to grant each other peace and atonement, and that was really moving to me. We live in such divided times today that there just seemed to be a real truth, a real inspiration, and a real strength in this story that really moved me. I got a chance in this book, The Storm on Our Shores, to tell the story of war from both sides, and not just from the view of the people in faraway offices deploying fighting men and women, today women, to the battlefield. But I got to write about the consequences on both sides, and it was really a terrific story. As you mentioned, one of the main people was kind of local. Dick Laird had grown up all over Appalachia, but by age 14, he was forced to drop out of school to start working at the Powhatan coal mine, just up the Ohio River there. And at age 16, he was underground and an explosives expert. And so it's a brutal job, really difficult. And he's getting hurt on the job. His friends are getting hurt. Some are getting killed. All over there are big accidents. At this time, this is one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. And so even in peacetime, the war hadn't yet begun, but Dick Laird was looking for something different. And so he signed on to the U.S. Army as kind of a way to give himself a shot at life above ground and not detonating explosives underground. At the same time, the other man I write about, his given name is Nobuo Tatsuguchi from Hiroshima, who had, while living in Japan, become a devoted Christian. And he came to the United States to get a college degree in California, Pacific Union College, and then went to medical school at Loma Linda in Southern California and interned at White Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles. He fell in love with America, especially in big contrast to his native country of Japan. He just found the United States, kind of open and thrilling, and people would take risks and go for success instead of trying not to fail. And he fell in love with, the open road and skyscrapers, and brought his girlfriend over from Japan, and he proposed to her at Yosemite National Park. They were married in Los Angeles, and for the honeymoon, they did one of the first Greyhound bus trips from Los Angeles to Niagara Falls. I mean, what more American thing could you do at that point in American time but honeymoon at Niagara Falls? Yeah. And he fell in love with America and came back to Los Angeles after his honeymoon, and there was a letter waiting for him that there was a family tragedy that had happened in Japan, and so he raced back with his wife to his home country of Japan, and that happened to be when Pearl Harbor happened. And so he was conscripted against his will to fight for Japan against the nation he loved, the United States.
Mark Obmascik is our guest. The Storm on Our Shores is the name of the book. One Island, Two Soldiers, The Forgotten Battle of World War II. The incident for which Dick Laird was so celebrated was the actual killing of Paul that actually came during a last-ditch charge by the Japanese, and that occurred, and then later a diary that Paul had been keeping became available all throughout the military and actually got published here in the United States, and it became a subject of great controversy. The way that you describe the battles themselves and how difficult they were, you had sources that nobody else had ever had access to.
This book was a lot of work. It took me a number of years. I had to take on other projects during the course of my research on this, but I spent a lot of time at the National Archives in Maryland. I spent a lot of time with families. These days people put their meals on Instagram. Yeah. and some people seem to put all their thoughts on Facebook. Well, this generation was a lot more circumspect, and so it was more difficult to figure out what they were thinking, what they were feeling, the kinds of things that a writer really needs to know to make a story come to life. And yet, while this generation did not have social media, the great thing is that they had pencil and paper, and they wrote letters home. They kept journals, and so between that and talks with their friends and families, I was kind of able to piece together not only the major events of their life, but how they got through them, what their doubts were. I was really struck by the story of both men who really were kind of ordinary men, but thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Paul Tatsuguchi was torn. He loved America, but was forced to fight for his native country against it. He was a devout Seventh-day Adventist, where they're morally opposed to war. In the United States, Tatsuguchi likely would have been a conscientious objector. They didn't have that status in Japan. And so he wrestled with his own conscience. How can he stay true to his faith and yet still serve his country? And his ultimate conclusion was that, yes, he would go to war, but he wouldn't really wage it. He would try to heal it by being a surgeon. He would try to help people in the aftermath of war rather than advancing it. But he was torn. Tatsuguchi was not really trusted by his fellow Japanese. He had spent so much time in the United States, fluent in English, had adopted many of the customs of Americans, dressed, wore American eyeglasses, a wristwatch, and there was some suspicion that he was a spy. As far as I could tell, he was the only Japanese doctor who was never given officer status. And I think, another reflection of kind of the Japanese distrust of him was that they sent him to this forbidding island called Attu in Alaska. Who's ever heard of this as a battle point? There were only about 4 dozen native Aleuts who were living on the island with a school teacher and her husband. The Japanese could have taken that island with a bullhorn. They didn't need an army. Yeah. And yet they sent a garrison of 3,000 men and took it. And ultimately, I think, because the Japanese were there, it became a fight over principle. Yeah. The United States felt that Japan couldn't have it.
It's called The Storm on Our Shores. 1 Island, 2 Soldiers, the Forgotten Battle of World War II. It's a heartbreaking story with a sweet little redemption at the end of it. And Mark Obmascik has been kind enough to join us here today. And it really is a great read.
Well, thanks so much. And it's a great pleasure to be there. Your part of the country breeds strong men.
Yeah.
And I know that firsthand from learning about the life of Dick Laird. There's heroism that runs there.
Terrific stuff. Mark, have a great day.
Thanks so much. You too.